And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. Now get ready for this one. Walter Burien, commodity trading advisor for 15 years. Walter is not afraid of large figures and is very familiar with what is called liquid investment funds. Now, we're going to talk with him about whether you own your government or your government owns you. Here's Walter on Coast to Coast. Walter, how are you?
Good evening, George.
Good to have you with us. Tell me about this. Who owns the government, or does our government own us? Is there even a question about that, Walter?
Well, when you look at the money involved and the control involved, it's gradually shifted over into a corporate, for-profit government in a veiled sense. You know, the public from 100 years ago, they were electing government. They were... it was more representative of the people. Today, it's more of a corporate oligopoly, controlling the public and utilizing the public as a resource management tool for profit. The key point is the golden rule. He who controls the gold makes the rules.
Yep.
And when you look at collective government, both local and federal, they've taken over the banking industry, the brokerage industry, if you look at collective government ownership of the stock market, if you break down individually different corporations, you'll find they're 60, 65, 70, 85% owned by collective government. Now, the public would never have even thought to look at that aspect. There's been a total blackout on the mentioning or discussion of collective totals or government ownership in collective totals for the last 65 years due to the condemning factor that when it's looked at and verified, it shows it's a totally different world than what we were told to believe.
And can you find it easily, or is it hidden, Walter?
It is there. Their whole game was never not making it not available. The whole game was never mention it, never talk about it, never discuss it. It's the old expression, if the largest tree in the forest fell, no one saw or heard it fall, did it actually make a sound?
Right.
And you've had people networking, large corporations networking, governments networking between themselves, constantly promoting, deficits and budget shortfalls as they've created a two-tier accounting structure where they'll show the tax revenue on the budget report, which they call the general purpose operating funds, as they've separated through what is called the comprehensive annual financial report, all of the investment funds, enterprise operations, venture projects, which are generating phenomenal money. So when the public, who's complaining about government growth and government overspending or collecting too much taxes, they are given a selectively created budget report, which shows where the tax income is spent. Well, the one problem with this picture is that when government separated off into the annual financial reporting and accounting structure, they shifted the investment and enterprise income only to reporting in the comprehensive annual financial report. The tax revenue was just shown on the budget report, so as the years went by, this started in 1946, by the way. And come the year 2000, if you look at any large entity, only 1/3 of the gross income is tax income. 2/3 of the gross income is return on investment funds and enterprise income.
Now, when Dwight Eisenhower was leaving the presidency, he warned us of the military-industrial complex. Is that part of what we're talking about right now?
Well, I've been studying this now for about 15 years, and what developed was in the after World War II, what you would call the boys, the large families, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and so forth. They knew government was where the money was. And what they did was they went to restructure government from a pay-as-you-go structure into an administrative clearinghouse for revenue collection. And they separated off the public was always familiar with the tax aspect of government. So by separating into an annual financial reporting and accounting structure and a selectively created budget report showing where tax revenue was spent and allocated, they were able to build their investment empires and start venture and enterprise projects, which were profit centers, which the public now was not looking at the income coming in due due to the fact it was not disclosed on the budget report. And they figured if they did this, they would have, and if they were controlling it and consulting and advising within it, they'd be able to get any project-backed corporation back anywhere around the world utilizing those funds. Well, that worked in the 40s, 50s, 60s, but by the 70s, government, in its management capacity, was building up so much wealth, so much investment capital. They started becoming the power structure over the large corporations and the individual families.
Sounds like that's what the Chinese are doing, Walter, except we all know that.
Well, we've laid out the blueprint.
Yeah.
I looked about 8 years ago. I came across an association that monitored all of the structures of different governments around the world as far as their tax income and the way they're structured. And as I started looking, I said, sheesh, 60% of the countries around the world were modeled after exactly what the U.S. was doing. So, it became very evident that it was a corporate blueprint for takeover. And what they're doing is consolidating world ownership and one standard for productivity management of the population under this one corporate global empire. And all of the non-players, the independents, are being targeted and systematically eliminated one by one.
Almost muscled?
They have the money, the investment wealth, and the capital to target any country, any organization, any company. If they're cooperating, they flourish. If they're not, they're put under.
Now, is this a club of people? Now, we know about the Illuminati and these families you just mentioned. Their influence is worldwide.
Correct.
So there really aren't countries anymore. We have the appearance, Walter, I think, of countries, but it's really not. There are no boundaries anymore, are there?
It's a corporate machine. It's gradually expanding its tentacles to be one solid conglomerate, and the population is becoming just simply a item for productivity management.
We're the drones for them, aren't we?
Well, it's the public has been masterfully entertained for the last several decades as the boys took it all over by investment. And, government is the actual true owner now of the banks, brokerage houses, insurance companies, and the large corporations by investment. The public there was a vacuum created, an intentional void created in the public's comprehension to make sure they didn't look. It was never discussed. And thus the public sat there being masterfully entertained as little bit by little bit, another piece was taken over, another piece was taken over until government took over the entire ball of wax.
Well, when we hear the phrase of a one-world government, I assume we can say that's going to be absolutely true.
Yes, and it is us that is doing it, primarily.
And we don't even know it.
You just have to look at the basics. What I'll be discussing on the show tonight are the basics. The intentional void that was created regarding the basics for people to look at and start finding out for themselves, because it's the most important information they could learn in their lifetime. Because everything we were told when we were little kids in grade school about the way the U.S. was, we were told Russia, was a bad thing because the government owned and controlled everything. But here in the United States, free country, the people own and control everything, control government, and that's a good thing. Well, when you actually look at the underlying reality of what's transpiring, that's flipped on its back. And in fact, government took over more control here in this country than Russia could have dreamed about back in the 40s.
There is one thing that's different in this country that the other ones don't have, and that is our right to bear arms right now. So many Americans own weapons and own arms. When do they attempt? Because if this is going to work, I think they've got to take the arms away. When are they going to try that?
Well, it's the aspect of taking arms away. There's an expression. Once you've stolen everything that someone else has, they strictly become a liability. And the public has been tapped into so much over the last several decades. There was an illusion of wealth building up within the private sector. but it was constantly, depleted by further government intrusion. And the public's getting a little bit irate, every day, every minute, every hour, especially after these trillion-dollar bailouts that were funneled on the backs of the population, which we're going to get into in a little bit. But the aspect of a fight, the Second Amendment, the Founding Fathers put that there exclusively in the event that government became a rogue government and was directly against the interests of the people, in fact, attacking the people, so that the public could defend themselves. Now, on the corporate level, and keep in mind now, the corporate structure is being run primarily by 70% attorneys. If you look at your governors, your congressmen, your senators, you're 70% attorneys now. They're dotting the I's and crossing the T's to secure as much cash at the present and to lock in the productivity value of the next 5 generations. And they get a little nervous on the aspect of public resentment. So you do have a natural tendency to say, well, armed prey, are not easy prey.
Yeah, exactly.
And they have a tendency to feel paranoid about the populace owning firearms. So it's becoming more and more restrictive. About 10 years ago, I looked at a couple of graphs. I was a commodity trading advisor for about 14 years, and I followed charts and statistics. And I looked at state by state who had the most restrictive gun laws and also who had the highest taxation state by state. Well, when you put the two charts together, the higher the taxation and fees and fines in a state, the more restrictive the gun laws.
Go figure, Walter, right?
I go back to, the statement, thieves do not like armed prey. So, there's a natural tendency, the more you're taking from the population, the less you want them to be able to fight back. I have not seen anyone in the last 15 years actually accomplish any major changes in government. You have the inside structure doing exactly what they want to do and taking exactly what they want to take. It's got to change.
It's got to change. And this seems, though, to me, the perception is, Walter, this is happening faster and faster and faster. And we'll get into the TARP funds and the bailouts when we come back from the break. But is it true? Is that perception accurate? Is it happening?
It all boils down to runaway greed. When you have greed just taking place as the principle of operation and with no accountability or consequence, it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Just like the little kid, he says, his parents say, don't go in the cookie jar, but he sneaks in and takes one cookie. Well, that was easy. He comes back in and takes 2.
Yeah.
And in no time, he's going to walk off with a cookie jar, unless he's caught and, scolded. But currently, right now, we have a network of attorneys, judges, and so forth that are protecting the inside crowd that are reaping the whirlwind of funds and money due to the factor that they're building up their own power base from having done so.
Good point. Stay with us, Walter. We're going to take this quick break. We'll be right back on Coast to Coast AM. Well, it's a new year. How about picking up StreamLink for yourself or as a gift for someone you care about for just pennies a day? You can get downloads, podcasting, past archives, iPhone apps, and just have some fun with it. Simply go to coasttocoastam.com for StreamLink. When we come right back, more with Walter Burien as we talk about who owns government or do they own you on Coast to Coast AM. Walter, tell us now, when you started telling other people about all of this, what was the reaction? Did they believe you?
Well, I started National Disclosure in June of 98. I kicked off with about 131 radio programs in 2 months. I was going around the clock. Broke the ice on the biggest game in town. And at first, the initial reaction, especially from those sharp players out there and corporate types, they would say, that's not possible. They couldn't have done that underneath my own nose. I'm too smart of a person. They never could have pulled that off. I would have seen it. That was the first reaction. And there was an ego problem. After about a year, and these people started looking, It's right there in front of everyone's faces. All they have to do is look. When they started looking and confirming, the next reaction was, it's too late, it's too big, it's so far advanced, no one's going to stop this. Depression set in. I would tell them, I would say, stop your whining. It took them 65 years to pull this off. That's a second time, time-wise. I said in 10 years with solid corrective action and, very importantly, the comprehension being picked up by the population, it can be corrected in 10 years. So, it's been a long journey over the last 10 years of, getting the word out and getting the comprehension to fill the void, the vacuum that was intentionally created due to the money involved. Now, a few points I'm going to qualify during the show.
Mm-hmm.
One very important point is at the end of 2008, they sucked about $35 trillion out of the world economy. And that went into specific accounts. That was someone's profit. Everyone else's loss was transferred into a profit for other accounts. They did it through the derivatives market, and I'll start to qualify that. The other point I'm going to qualify are the collective totals, how to verify, how to look, and establish the takeover by government, how they've done it, and the way it was pulled off and where they stand now. The third point in the latter part of the show, I'm going to cover the point of how it is possible at this point in time to phase out all taxation in this country, and not just this country, around the world. Right now, the world economy is based on cash, taxation, and investment.
Right.
The taxation is the only evil word in the equation. There's nothing evil about cash. There's nothing evil about investments in principle. Taxation is pure extortion, and it's been justified through many different tactics. Now, I'll ask you one question first, George.
Okay,
do you know the easiest way for me to steal $100,000 from you?
Tax me for it.
No.
No.
That's one way, but it's not the easiest.
Okay. What would it be?
The easiest way is if you didn't know you had it in the first place.
All right, explain that.
When government builds up wealth, investment wealth, enterprise income, and they're constantly promoting tax income, which currently is only 1/3 of the gross income,
mm-hmm.
the public doesn't even know the other 2/3 exists due to that intentional void and vacuum that was created.
Well, that's true. We think it's gone, right?
Right.
Or it's not even around.
And government has done such a grand job at taking it all over by investment, with a little bit of administrative restructuring, you could set it up to phase out all taxation, not lower taxation, eliminate all taxation.
All done. Until the end of time. Gone.
And have a thriving economy and virtually zero unemployment rate.
Well, you'd get a lot of people supporting that, Walter.
They have to comprehend it first. And the good point is... And
this is without a use tax or anything like that.
Correct.
Right?
And the structure is in place today to do it. I strongly recommend that your listeners on the next break, they call their friends, their associates, their business partners, have them tune in. I'm going to cover a lot of detail. I'll be very specific. Most people get lost in the forest, from the trees, the branches, and the leaves. What I'll be discussing, period, is the forest, qualifying what the true forest is, the whole beach. And, from that perspective, it'll become evidently clear that taxation is not needed. Taxation can be phased out. We can downsize and limit government back to where it should have been. If you go from 1965 forward, government has been expanding at such an exponential rate, exceeding the population's income and the population's growth by a factor of 4 to 1. And it's not right.
But we've let that happen.
Well, due to the money involved, we're constantly barraged by 10,000 sound bites, confusing us at every direction until we're throwing our hands up screaming, no more, no more. I want to go out and enjoy my coffee, take a trip down to the beach. The overload, sensory overload everyone is exposed to is massive. And it's constantly manipulated to make sure that the public stays off in la-la land, not focusing on what they should be focusing on to take back control of the situation.
Do you know what would happen to the economy if people weren't taxed, if they could use that money any way they wanted to buy things, save their money? It would be just a huge boost to the economy.
Right, but then government says, well, how can we fund our schools and our police and our fire departments? Oh, we'd have to shut it all down, sell our buildings. And that is such a line of garbage. It's not funny. I'll give you one example.
All right.
You know what a pension fund is, correct?
Sure do.
Okay. A pension fund is designed from the investment return of the fund to pay someone their salary and benefits at retirement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very simple. Well, the exact same principle can be structured on the city level, county level, school district level, where you create what I call a TRF fund, tax retirement fund, set up exactly like a pension fund, except it's designed to meet the ongoing budgetary obligations into perpetuity, and you can phase out all taxation. And it can be done through a full audit of the local government, a statistical review, an actuary who writes a pension fund. You know, they make the determination of how much money do we have here, how much money are we going to need to get the fund balance to equal a certain objective. Well, the objective here is to meet the budgetary obligations.
How's it funded?
Well, pension funds are funded with 1.5% coming in from local governments and 1.5% coming in from employees. And you're now on the multi-trillions in collective totals for local and federal government pension funds, just from 1.5%. If you're doing a TRF fund, you can come in identifying surplus revenues is one area, which gives you a phenomenal boost right off the bang on the funding. You allocate X percentage of the gross income coming into the fund's balance, and you also do a little bit of downsizing. As I mentioned, the growth in government has been so excessive over the last 3 decades. It's not a good thing.
It sounds easy to fix, but I don't think it is. Well,
the reason it's not easy to fix is due to the factor that we've allowed easy money to run rampant within the circles of D.C. and local governments. I like to use metaphors, and this is an excellent metaphor that kind of explains our situation. It's simple but true. Now, George, do you have any children?
I have 3 children and 5 grandchildren now, Walter.
Okay. Your children, when they were 14, 15 years old, would you have given them carte blanche to write their own allowance check?
No.
That's what everyone says. But why did we do that with our own government? Here we have ruthless players, okay, that and you're dealing with hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, and just as if you had given your 15-year-old son carte blanche to write his own allowance check, unless he was a saint, pretty soon he's going to be, if you made $1,500 a week, pretty soon he'd be cutting a check for $1,800 a week, putting you in debt for $300 a week. Any questions? It's exactly what we have going on right now.
Well, maybe we're sheep, Walter. Though we just follow. Most people just follow. They don't do what you do, and they don't put their foot down. They just follow.
Well, most people legitimately are honest, ethical. They want to see good. I've watched people all through my lifetime, wanting to help out their neighbors, community, solid businessmen, sharp ideas, good work ethics. And on another analogy, say, for example, your local bank over the weekend left the front doors open, all the cash lying on the counter, security cameras turned off, no guards watching the money. You could have 1,000 people walk by, and they would look over and say, hey, the doors are open, the cash is lying on the counter, no one's guarding it. There must be a problem here. Some people would try to call the bank.
Or we're on candid camera, right?
Yeah, that's another thought. Some would even go up and try to close the doors. Probably about 65% of the people would just stand there in a crowd, milling around going, should we? Well, all it takes is 2 or 3 out of 1,000 to walk by saying, hey, look at these bozos. They left the cash lying on the counter, and look at all these clowns outside. No one's taking it. Let's grab it before somebody else does. Well, when you let that 2 or 3 out of 1,000 walk in the doors 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 25 years ago, you're going to have exactly what we have right now. Now, I watched the CNN coverage of the bailouts.
Right.
And what I caught as one consistency, and it really stood out, about every 20 seconds, you can go back and watch those tapes, about every 20 seconds you'd hear uncontrollable laughter coming from the crowd, the people that are discussing the matter. Hey, I'm going to get $500 billion. They're even offering me $700 billion. Whoa, as they chuckle back and forth, saying, "This is so easy money."
Yeah.
And let me qualify one point, and this will get a lot of your listeners very mad. The slump in the economy. Now, I was a derivatives trader for 32 years. I was a commodity trading advisor for 14. I was one of the first tenants up in the World Trade Center back in '78, 3 years after they opened. And did an international news line on commodities. My specialty was silver and U.S. Treasury bonds. But the derivatives market, I always keep a close eye on. And government, let's go back to 2000. Alan Greenspan was quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying he was concerned about the $80 trillion a year international derivatives market.
Uh-huh.
Okay? Now jump ahead to the year 2008. Greenspan forgot to mention that government was writing about 65% of the paper in that market.
That's right.
All the states, cities, counties, federal governments, they were the ones, the institutional accounts, that were doing the most trading. If you look at Pennsylvania's CAFR, the state of Pennsylvania, under Note D, it shows their derivative activity for the year. Puts, calls, stock options, futures, advanced forward currency contracts. They're doing more volume than Merrill Lynch did in the derivatives market. That's just one state.
One state.
And you may have cities within a state that are larger than the state itself on the equity hub. When I looked at New York back in '98, total liquid investment assets for the state was about $635 billion. Then I got a hold of the Manhattan Metro CAFR, which included Manhattan, Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island. $1.2 trillion.
Now, where is all this money, Walter?
Invested. And I also noticed that, I was looking at Ohio, their state CAFR, and I noticed half of their budget was subsidized by federal money. Half. Excuse me. I said, why? Ohio's a wealthy state. But then I started looking at where their investments, the state of Ohio's investments were, and they had over half of their money invested with federal programs. So I saw right off the bang that one elbow scratches the other. The local governments invest more with the federal government gives more back in grants to that local government.
Right.
Okay.
Back and forth.
Exactly, and it's a corporate game. As I mentioned this all started back in 45, 46. GFOA, Government Financial Officers Association, 100% private association, with a nice government-sounding acronym, is the one that started promoting the annual financial reporting and accounting structure for local governments.
Well, when this scheme, I'll call it a scheme, when this scheme started, give me the scenario how these players put it together.
Well, as I mentioned, the large families knew government was where the money was. So they had the expertise, the resources, and the funding to back these private associations and to market them to the local governments until, by consult, they were taking over the operations of local governments. You now have the Council of Mayors, Council of Governors, one accounting group after another.
All of them.
And even on the stock ownership from local governments, I put up on my front page, CAFR1.com, the state retirement fund for New York. Now, I put up state retirement funds, for examples of CAFRs due to the factor that out of due diligence, it's mandatory that they list their investments when purchased, current market value, and how much.
Are they forthright in doing that?
Yeah, it's they drafted the pension funds for due diligence on disclosure where it was maintained. Now, local government CAFRs, they'll show their consolidated totals in the consolidated financial columns, but they will not they will not openly show where that money is invested and in what.
Interesting. And they're not required to?
Not really, because you have, as I mentioned, GFOA started the CAFR accounting structure, and the group that took it over as far as calling the shots for how the accounting is laid out is called GASB, Government Accounting Standards Board. another 100% private association. And by transmittal letter, they will make modifications on how things are reported. Now, up until 98, they had 100% lock on the game. The inside players were reviewing the reports. Keep in mind, you have, when your structure is that big, you have to keep your own records. The comprehensive annual financial report was their records, their internal document. People have called it two sets of books. It's not. The annual financial report is the book. The budget report is an inferior document. It's the lesser. You'll see the budget in the comprehensive annual financial report, but it's only about one-third of the revenue.
Now, when you were saying, though, that taxation is only about a third of all of this,
correct,
and we could do away with taxation, it would seem to me then that our tax money is almost all profit. Every year, it just keeps rolling in their coffers more and more.
Well, not when they separate it. Keep in mind, I'll go back to a conversation I had with a Senator Cal Cunningham from North Carolina. This was back in, I think, 2001. North Carolina was citing a $700 million shortfall on their budget, the state. And about 45 minutes into the conversation, I said, Cal, if North Carolina went back to the same scope and size it was just 3 years earlier, they'd have a $5.5 billion surplus.
Yeah.
They had increased their expenditures by close to $8 billion. That's what created the $700 million shortfall.
Now, and when you say increase their expenditures, where'd that kind of money go, Walter?
Keep in mind, when the public is not really looking, there's so many structures built up from within the inside. It's the definition of greasing the skids. They promote different services to the public, but as they do so, you have their friends, their buddies, their associates, kicking it off and running the show, and a lot of money is changing hands and
bidding on the deals, right?
The wealth base builds, and the public sitting off there in la la land following instructions. I mean, it's just leaving the vault door wide open. And I go back to the 15-year-old kid having carte blanche to write his own allowance check. You're going to be buried financially real quick. And they were doing whatever they could get away with and justifying it in any fashion, to take more money, build their power base. Now, on the government pension funds, which was the first original, mode of taking over by investment, one thing most government employees don't realize, the government employees are kind of getting shafted here. Local governments set up their pension funds as strictly participatory. And what strictly participatory means is like buying a ticket on a train. You get to ride from point A to point B, but when you get off of point B, you don't own one piece of the train.
And you're off it. Walter, we're going to take this break, and we're going to come right back. We'll continue talking about this, and also we'll take some phone calls with you on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest tonight, Walter Burien. We're going to take phone calls with Walter and continue this discussion. Plus, soon we'll get into the TARP program, the bailout program, and what it all means as well. Walter, I want to talk about this eliminating of all taxation with some of the work you're doing in just a second. But the TARP program and the bailout program seems to me a public version of what they've been doing all these years, is it?
Well, I mentioned about the $35 trillion being sucked out of the world economy at the end of 2008.
Right.
When I give a definition there, that'll answer that question. As I mentioned, in 2000, the derivative market was about $80 trillion worldwide, and then they expanded it to about $600 trillion from 2008. And the majority of that expansion was through the banks, but for the primary investors, which were local and federal government investment funds. The come right around a little bit before March. It was actually August. CalPERS International had an AP press release saying they wanted to hire another 450 derivative desk traders for their international operation. Now, 450 desk traders is larger than what Merrill Lynch would have.
That's huge.
And this was just their add-on. That was my tip-off that they were getting ready for the big slam. Because you had the Dow up around 14,000. Crude oil was just at 150. Precious metals were, at a high at that time. And I put out an email alert on September 15th stating, get ready for the biggest market chaos and collapse seen in the last 60 years. Have cash in hand. Be prepared. Neocons at work.
Go.
Yeah, neocons at work. What they did was, now, government outsourced a lot of their investment capital starting in the 80s. And CalPERS International actually is one good example. They funneled money from California and other local governments from all over the country to participate due to the factor that usually on the local government investment funds, they were restricted by statute where they couldn't have more than 5-10% invested outside of the country or outside of the dollar. And by participating on the international investment front, they were now not subject to those pesky little rules, basically is what was done. So, they started the marketing in the 80s and, trillions funneled offshore for management. Now, going into the end of 2008, on the international and also on some of the large domestic operations, the investment funds heavily shorted the international derivatives market for the stock indexes worldwide. They heavily shorted precious metals. They heavily shorted, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of contracts.
And to those who don't know what that means you are betting that everything's going to go down, not up, right?
Right. A derivative is strictly a contract bet. It's always written in time, 3 months out, 6 months out, 1 year out, 2 years out, where there's a buyer and a seller, and they take a commitment on one side of the trade. If you buy, you're going long, and if you sell first, you're going short. And it's all done on paper, so you really don't have to have the physical commodity to back it up because you can always cancel out your trade on paper before it comes due at the end of that time period.
And you got to scramble.
So they heavily shorted the precious metals, heavily shorted crude oil, heavily shorted the international stock indexes, and heavily went long the dollar. The dollar index at that time was at about 71. And then what happened was they started dumping their physical holdings. Now, as I mentioned, government outsourced a long time ago. So they were well diversified in all different currencies and investments, China, Russia, Mexico, all over the world, probably on the tune of about $26 trillion on international investments. And what they did was, to perpetuate the collapse, they cashed in about $4 trillion, maybe $4.5 trillion of their international investments, which were held in other currencies. China, Chinese yuan, Mexico, Mexican peso, Russia, ruble. And by doing so, they now were going to convert back into dollars, which meant buying dollars. So from the end of 2008, last 3 months there, the dollar index went from 71 up to 89 in a month and a half.
Jeez.
The biggest pop, straight shot, in the shortest period of time ever on the dollar index. And that was due to the fact that they were cashing in about $4.5 trillion of the international investments, converting it back into dollars. Now, during that time period, everybody from across the country is saying, the dollar is going to go down through the floor. It's going to go worthless.
Right.
And I'm there, yay, get a clue. Take a look what's happening. And it took its largest spike. Now, simultaneously, crude oil dropped from $145 a barrel straight down to $28.
Yeah, it plummeted.
That amazed me. I thought it would stop at about $38, $42, and it went right through to $28.
Yeah, it kept going down.
About a month before it did that, I was looking at the crude oil options, and I noticed there were several 100,000 put options at $60. And I said, sheesh. Someone was taking massive commitments, expecting it to break $60, in a very short period of time.
Right.
There was nothing in between either. I mean, very small quantities up to 140, but at $60, massive, a couple 100,000 contracts. Well, I understood when I saw it at 28, But the precious metals also went down, into the toilet during that time, and the U.S. Treasuries, they went long the U.S. Treasuries heavily. The U.S. 30-year bonds, the life of contract highs were, up until that point, for decades, was 120, 123.24. And it shot through from 112 up to 142, which was also, that's, when the price goes up in the bonds, that means lower interest rates. And when you have a collapse in the markets, normally the normal trader would think, well, money's going to get tight, interest rates are going to go up. So the entire public got burnt there. The whole game for the last 30 years is schooling the minnows back and forth to one end of the pond or the other, as the sharks feast.
Yeah, exactly.
The government is the shark now, and, it's being done in cooperation with, the syndicated media on priming the public, to be reactionary in one direction or another, and they get burned every single time. But, so here's this massive collapse, and as I mentioned, government's now, selling off their physical holdings internationally, which is perpetuating it internationally. They're dumping some of their physical holdings domestically, which is causing the collapse and perpetuating the collapse here, as they sat back making a phenomenal profit on those massive short positions.
Okay, now, while all this is going on, Walter, how do you explain the economic bubble collapse that affected people, the foreclosures, the losing jobs? What happened there?
The game was perpetuated due to the factor that the interest rate swap bubble, mortgages and so forth, that was ballooning and ballooning. They were trading that back and forth internationally, dividing, subdividing, trading these mortgages back and forth on these derivative contracts. That there was even duplication on the same principle in many instances. But keep in mind, on a derivative contract, you can put it on for 5 minutes, 5 days, or 5 months. So as these contracts rolled over, being bought, being sold, if the institutional funds that were making the money on each transaction, whether it be for 5 days or, 5 minutes, when they close out that transaction, they have no further liability. If they're doing excellent, they're walking off with truckloads of cash, because they've closed out their position. Once it's settled,
sure,
it generates the money. So as the balloon was building, the bubble was building, truckloads of cash were being walked off with from the players, creating that balloon. Then when they were ready to collapse it,
on purpose, right?
They take their positions, on the short side, and then it's like musical chairs. The music stops all of a sudden.
Grab what's left.
A few million backholders. And they hit so hard, so heavy across the board that, there were so many defaults. You can only steal so much from someone. If someone gets caught in a derivative trade and they lose $140 million and they only have $100 million, they're $40 million in default. And they did it so hard, so fast, so quickly, they created defaults worldwide, massive levels of defaults.
And that's what got Bernie Madoff, right?
No, he kind of, he couldn't play his shell game anymore of selling fictitious transactions. There was some accountability that came to play. Now, if he had been, he was dealing with the public. That's why he went on so long. If he had been burning government accounts, they would have stopped him in 1/10 the time.
Right away, yeah.
But he knew not to, suck in the government fund managers because he would have gotten tagged. The public,
that's okay, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But so here they pull out $35 trillion, out of the world economy. And what people have to understand is on a derivative transaction, for every dollar lost in one account, a dollar is credited to another account. And here we're talking about trillions of dollars that transferred hands in a very short period of time, about a month and a half, 2 months in time, is the time period it took for that collapse.
Yeah.
So now here's the definition of arrogance. They now come in with $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there of taxpayer revenue to shore up their own casino, which they just stole $30 trillion out from the entire world economy, causing the situation in the first place.
They took the definition of OPM, other people's money, and they used it brilliantly, didn't they?
Well, they've been laughing all the way down to the bank for the last 30 years.
Yeah. And
the arrogance level just keeps getting more extreme and more severe because it's so easy for them to do without consequence or accountability. Bernie Madoff, he was about $30 billion that he kind of funneled through there. But even $30 billion's pocket change when you look at what the government's dealing with. Now, there's a lot of honest and ethical people within government that are, trying to do a good job, and they're, trying to maintain doing something ethical. But what happens is when you have the power structure building from the people that are cutting the deals under the table, doing things on the sly with no accountability, they're building up their wealth base, and they become the power structure, plain and simple.
And they don't care about the other people, the ones that fall by the wayside.
And they'll go in there and appoint or get, the people that are supposed to oversee this and accountability, they'll put their friends in to make sure there's no consequence to their own actions. It's the definition of letting the foxes write the rules and how many hens to eat out of the hen house.
Walter, while we continue to talk, I've got a slew of folks who want to talk with you and ask you a question or two, so let's grab a few while we can here. Let's go to Russ in Iowa. You're up with us. Go ahead, Russ.
Well, yeah, I tell you, after listening to this dialogue, I hate to say I'm probably going to switch questions and things. And when it comes to the commodities like you're talking about and things of that nature, I actually do a little farming on the side. I've traded commodities fairly extensively the last 7 years. And it just seems like it's changed tremendously. And you talk about the arrogancy and things like that. When you look at like corn and soybeans and things like that, and all the
fundamentals don't mean a thing anymore, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but my question is, does it eventually come around that the actual supply and demand will eventually come into place? And in other words, it will eventually come into play, but the extreme movements outside of the fundamentals is where they steal everyone's money, because everyone becomes overconfident, saying you can't do this, and all of a sudden it's doing 3 times more than they said couldn't be done in the first place. And there goes the money out of their account balances, and they swing it back real quick in the opposite direction. You'll get whipsawed back and forth as you're played. Right. Yeah. Obviously, I mean, the more movement in it, the more these people can make money. And I mean, kind of a sad story. I actually sold oil at I think 142, thinking it was going to go down, figuring that they were playing games on it because everyone was claiming it was going to go to well over 200. And I figured that once they made the claim it was going to go over 200, that's when it was going to go down. And I had a stop at like 149, and it hit it, and then after that, it just made a run down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, keep in mind this one example. Say for example, Israel nuked Iran tonight, and everyone said, "Oh my God, silver is going to go right through the roof," and the entire population came out and bought 400,000 silver futures contracts. One futures contract is 5,000 ounces of silver, so 400,000 contracts is a lot of silver.
A lot of silver.
Massive. Well, if the institutional government accounts then came in and sold 400,001 contracts, guess what? Price is going down. And if they keep selling, all those people that just jumped in there, they're going to be stressed out of the market, taking severe losses, and get stopped out with substantial losses.
Good point. Can the little man make money, Walter, like this?
Well, as I mentioned, I've been trading for 32 years. What I look for, as your friend just mentioned there, or your caller, the cue for me when I look is, they're constantly promoting to the minnows to get them schooling in one direction or another. And usually when they're saying, "Oh my God, it's going through the floor, there's no stopping," that's usually close to your bottom. And when they, if something's going up and they're giving like reasonable expectations of climbs, maybe varying a little bit, the second it goes to, it's going to jump like this right through the roof, and there's no real justification, that's your cue that you're getting ready for the big clip.
Mm-hmm.
Traditionally, it's about right 8 out of 10 times, and you have to adjust for, my friends I've been trading with for like 30 years, I've learned to ask myself one question first before I make a move.
And that is?
Where would they push it at this point if they wanted to screw everybody? And I pick that point, and that's usually where it hits.
Yeah. Up or down?
Yeah, either or, yeah. Because the whole game is to, drive everyone out of their positions or bait them in to overextend themselves and cut their legs off.
Let's go to Oakland, Maryland. First-time caller, Curtis, you're on.
George, thanks for taking my call.
Sure thing.
I wanted to commend Walter on his efforts here. I'm a long-time listener, clear back in the early days of Art Bell, and I've always believed in the movements that Art's talked about on the air, and also you, George. And I just want to let Walter know that he's a breath of fresh air, because I was involved with a group back in the 90s that had a lot of issues with the things that Walter's covered tonight, and most of the time we were put up as conspiracy theorists because it was easy to go along with the norm, which the norm was what the government was preaching. Mm-hmm. And today, people like Walter are opening people's eyes, and I'm really thankful for that. And one question for Walter that I have real quick, and that is, Walter, do you think there's any possibility that our money system will find its way back to the gold system, and or do you think that there's a need for that? And if not, what do you think is a good substitute?
Well, I'm going to jump back to 1963-64 when we were on the silver standard and gold, and when they got off of it due to the factor that there was not enough silver and gold to back the intrinsic value that was maintained in the United States. Keep in mind, there's little money in circulation compared to the intrinsic value of the property, wealth, and assets in the United States. So, the United States was expanding, so the Federal Reserve, was their brainchild.
Yep.
Was actually a brilliant idea, because what they did, for their benefit, what they did now, a currency is strictly a bartering tool.
Walter, let's get this break. We're going to come right back to that question and your answer about the gold standard. We'll be right back on Coast to Coast AM. After Dark, it's a magazine that you'd love when you call 1-888-727-5505. You can also go online at coasttocoastam.com. All kinds of great stories with After Dark. Walter's website, by the way, is linked up at coasttocoastam.com right now, so we make it very easy for you to go over there and take a look at some of his work, and we'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Walter, the break got us when we were talking about whether we would ever go back to the gold standard, and you were telling us, hey, we were on it once, but we ran out of gold and silver in order to back it up.
Well, I'll start off with one statement. Whenever you have massive wealth, as we do in this country, there is always the potential for massive theft. Now, going back to the Federal Reserve, it was a brilliant move on the players' part. The dollar, is strictly a bartering tool. It's a piece of paper with ink on it. Mm-hmm. And the gold, when we're on the gold standard and silver standard, there was actually only about 5%, if that, maybe 3% of the actual commodity backing up the intrinsic value and wealth in the country. And that was a very dangerous situation. A country like India has more gold and silver than the United States does. Probably even a small country like Thailand may have more gold than we have. But when they went over to the fiat dollar, not backed by precious metals, the Federal Reserve was designed to maintain the value of that bartering tool. Keep in mind, back thousands of years ago, they used copper, gold, silver. They used cattle, sheep. Some tropical islands used to use seashells as bartering tools for trade, except they don't fit too well on ATMs, so I guess why they faded out. But as they increase the money in circulation, I call the dollar a zero-based currency. And the reason I call it that is, for every dollar that goes out, 100% of it goes back through government, through taxation, one little bit at a time until it's 100% recycled. What government did over the decades, each year, they would take 3, 4, 5%, 6%, 7%, and invest it. And each year, another 3, 4, 5, 6, 8%, invest it. So those, 4, 5, 6% added up each year to where come the year 2000, government had taken it all over by investment. The banks, the corporations, the insurance companies. And keep in mind, when you own, say, 75, 80% of a corporation in collective totals, effectively you can determine the policy.
That's right.
Now, no local government can own more than 5% of any one corporation. Some 7% is the standard. But what happens here is private associations now come in and network with, say, 2,000, 3,000 different local governments. There's approximately right now about 184,000 separate local government entities in the United States. Every city, every county, every school district, financial enterprise operation, regular enterprise operation, they're a separate entity, each with their own investments, each with their own assets. And when you start adding up the collective totals, it becomes evidently clear as to who owns what. But these private associations now, say representing 3,000, 3,500 different local governments, those collective 5% or 4% ownerships of different companies now collectively pooled, and if those local governments are giving proxy vote rights to the private associations, now the upper management can go to the board of directors meetings representing 3,000 local governments. And by proxy and the collective ownership, they may be the primary shareholder, owning 65% of that company. Now, they can determine policy. In fact, if they wanted to, they could replace the entire board of directors by exercising those proxy votes. So when people were blaming companies for outsourcing over to India, China, Russia, Mexico, it was not really the government, it was not really the corporations want to outsource, but being that the government owned those corporations through stock ownership, collective stock ownership, they were exerting their influence to have those companies outsource, so their profits would go up. Now, as I mentioned, I put the New York State Retirement Fund up on I'm not picking on them, it's just a nice example of a big, comprehensive annual financial report,
yeah.
And the pension funds show the actual investments. As you go down through the listing of investments, you'll see the top profit makers, 2, 3, 4, 5, 600% profits. In order of the best, you have the pharmaceutical companies. You then have the financial and banking structures. You then have the oil companies, and then you have the war industry groups, top profit makers. There's a slight tad bit of conflict of interest there, he says, on all policy decisions. When you start looking at the ownership, and especially entire industries that are owned in collective totals, it starts becoming crystal clear as to why the policy that is determined is determined. It guarantees profit for their own holdings. The pharmaceutical companies, which are the number ones, here they're funneling out hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer revenue, funneling through all of the drugs to the elderly, the young, and everyone in between at exorbitant prices, being paid for with taxpayer revenue, which guarantees them a profit on their own investment holdings. The health care bill that just passed, the syndicated media was honest on 2 points. They said, well, the biggest beneficiary here will be the pharmaceutical companies, and the second biggest beneficiary will be the insurance companies. The one thing they didn't mention was government owns the pharmaceutical companies by collective ownership, and they're the number one investor with the insurance companies that will now have less liability.
Go figure, right?
Yeah, as I mentioned, when you start looking at the forest, the basics becomes crystal clear. And the public, it's never talked about, never discussed, never qualified due to the factor that it is crystal clear when you look at the basics. Now, keep in mind the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, or Annual Financial Report for Government, is the holy grail of accounting. Okay, it's like the Bible or the Torah or the, so forth for the Catholic Church and religious organizations. The CAFR is their Bible. Never peep, never mention, never word. People are constantly hearing budget report. And that's a selective grouping of tax revenue coming in and going out, with everything else excluded. The annual financial report shows the entire picture. Now, if you were a shareholder in a public corporation, AT&T, IBM, Xerox, it's mandatory that you get the annual financial report each and every year by SEC law.
Sure.
Here, government is holding back their annual financial report in all, intents and purposes. It's right there to see if you look, but they never mention, never discuss, not a peep, not a mention, not a word. Thus, the game continues and the beat goes on.
And the beat goes on. Let's take a call. Santa Ana, California. Hank, west of the Rockies. Go ahead, Hank.
Yes, good evening, George, a long-time listener. And I sent you an email some time ago that addresses these problems we're discussing tonight, including a solution to our Social Security and Medicare problems. But that's not the discussion tonight, so we'll skip it. But one of the things that was in the email was addressing this problem of providing some sort of a financial incentive for fiscal responsibility by our President, Congress, and the Senate back there in Washington with regard to our deficit and the debt. And another thing that we need to do, and that's what I would like to see us do, is go to the fair tax, which means that everybody would have to pay their share. We would no longer have to do a tax return every year. And now then even the over 30 million invaders and all the politicians in Washington would have to pay their share of the tax as well.
What do you think of that one, Walter?
Well, I've looked at the fair tax and so forth. I love the expression labeled fair. But when you impose a tax, okay, a consolidated tax, number one, the public has been spoon-fed taxation, and when they've been holding back 2/3 of their gross income and not qualifying the investment income, the enterprise income, equating it with tax income, it's highly misrepresentative to push this fair tax because the structure is so inherently corrupt due to that non-disclosure and that void of comprehension that's been created within the population's mind that, when you don't need taxation at all, period, and government can operate from investment wealth, it's the word taxation is, in my mind, it's an evil word. It's not something to be applied or used because it's not the true alternative. That's as simple as I can put it. On in general principle, the fair tax is a decent idea, but when you look at the underlying core of the non-disclosure taking place, it makes it irrelevant because you cannot add on another atrocity, so to say. When you do not disclose, the reality of the core substance that you're dealing with. Jim Florio in New Jersey. When I first got into this, I found out about it back in 1990 in New Jersey, and Jim Florio, the governor, had a $2.8 billion tax increase.
Mm-hmm.
It was prepared by the prior administration, but he could have vetoed it and stopped it, and he ran on a no new tax platform. So, the proverbial hit the fan. And a group sprung up. There was two DJs, John and Ken from 101.5 FM in Trenton. They're now out in L.A., John and Ken.
Oh, yeah. No more.
Yeah, well, they were rabble-rousing, taking calls from listeners on examples of waste and misspending in government. I was listening in the first couple of days, and I heard examples, 5,000, 15,000. The highest figure I heard was 85,000. I was chuckling. Called into the show with the budget report, which is the only thing I knew about at the time. Right out the bottom line figures, they had $11 billion on budget, $6 billion off budget, total service budget $17 billion, net available, I think it was $23.4 billion.
God.
And I said, come on, guys, you're missing the whole point. The state's dealing with billions of dollars. If there's fraud, waste, and misspending taking place, probably taking place on the tunes of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions. And John and Ken challenged us to start an organization to repeal the tax increase. And 10 of us got together. I incorporated a group called Hands Across New Jersey. And we had our first rally 10 days out from that with the help of John and Ken rabble-rousing around the clock. We had everybody converge from all the shore points on Trenton. We had 175,000 cars converge on Trenton.
Well, and that leads me to this question, Walter. What do we do to stop the things you've pointed out tonight?
Well, that goes into I launched a new website called taxretirement.com, and the site is what it states, tax retirement, retiring taxation. Going back to what I mentioned earlier regarding using the pension fund principle to operate the government's budgetary bases, that's the primary goal of that site, and to do it through initiative, one venue at a time, where we go in, do a complete audit, statistical review, prepare a prospectus,
showing the phase-over points where, from the investment return, taxation can be phased out. And in fact, actually, if it does quite well, you can issue a dividend return back to the resident property owners. When you have property tax in any local venue, you don't own your property. You're a renter. Try not paying your property tax. They'll come in and seize your property.
They seize you. That's right. They sell the taxes off, and they get your property.
You could have a $5 million property, and you're $100,000 behind. They'll come in and take your $5 million property and sell it for 40 cents on the dollar to one of their buddies. It's extortion. Keep in mind, Al Capone back in the 30s, he would tell local businesses, well, if you're going to do business in my town, you're going to pay me 25%.
Going to muscle you.
And if they said, well, I'm not going to pay you 25%, he'd go, yeah, you're right. You're going to pay me 35%. If you don't pay me in 2 weeks, I'm going to firebomb you out. And he did. There's not too big of a difference in what's going on.
One at a time.
And in fact, if you look at organized crime from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, everything that they were doing,
we're doing now. Government's doing that.
Government's doing now, and they've expanded it 100 times fold.
And they're getting away with it.
Yeah, because they took it over. If you took all the Genoveses, Gambinos, Al Capones, Giancanas, put them all together, it'd look like a bunch of kids on the street corner selling lemonade in comparison to what government's doing.
What about the state, let's say like California, that claims it's going broke? Yeah, are they going broke?
I smile every time I hear Schwarzenegger saying, we're $42 billion behind on our budget. Keep in mind, I think there's about 14,000, 15,000 local governments in California.
Mm-hmm.
If you take the state and the local government's collective investment wealth, you're probably up to around $12 trillion in totals. Now, when they say they're $32 billion behind, in reality, that's pocket change. But you have to keep the illusion going, to keep the public at bay.
It's like a guy who's got a lot of money and he still borrows from his friends.
Well, ask me the number one thing that caught my eye the most on what government does with their investment funds.
Well, let's see. Where would they squander it?
No. Well, it's what they do. I noticed, like how government promotes their debt constantly. We need this new bond issuance. We need this.
Yeah.
Well, what government does is they promote their debt at the front door, and then they come in and finance their own debt with their own investment assets through the back door. They'll cut a deal with a bank, brokerage house, insurance company, or even set up their own financial enterprise operation, funnel all of their investment assets into it. Then they'll have a bond issuance, and then use their own investment assets to fund their own debt.
And they let the taxpayers pay it off.
Locking in an investment for themselves for the next 20 years. A good example would be, say, for example, George called me up and he said, Walter, I have $5 million in cash. I want to hide it. I want you to start a mortgage company. I'm going to give you $5 million in cash. I'm going to buy a $5 million property out in my state. I want you to underwrite my mortgage, and I want you to charge me the highest interest rate you can get away with. So you give me $5 million in cash. I pay my $225 license fee for starting a mortgage company. You buy a $5 million property. I underwrite your mortgage. I charge you 16% interest. Now you go around to all your friends, neighbors, business associates going, oh, my God, this $5 million mortgage is killing me. I don't know if I'll survive. Oh. Well, when you forget to mention it's your $5 million and you're collecting the 16% through me, slight tad bit of misrepresentation there. Now, if you went to a local government, say, for example, they're funding their own, say, $100 million in bonds through this one city, through an insurance company. If you said, are you funding your own debt? They can honestly say no. But if you told them, if you asked them, do you have $100 million invested with finance company X, and is finance company X, underwriting and funding your $100 million bond, then they'd have to say yes. That's the example of promoting your debt at the front door and, funding it through the back door.
Where do people see your documentary on that, eliminating taxes?
I've been working on it. I'm scheduling the release for January 10th. It's going to be called The Only Game in Town, The Way Our Government Can Be. The last documentary I did in 2000. It was called The Biggest Game in Town. I released it on VHS, and there was a couple thousand copies sold all over the country and the world, and people made thousands and thousands of copies. There was probably 150,000 in circulation. Well, on December of 2008, I finally got the equipment to play the VHS, upload it to my computer, convert it, and upload it to Google. So on December 25th, I uploaded The Biggest Game in Town onto Google. within 5 days, it had 870,000 views worldwide.
Gosh.
And went right through to the front page of Google.
Good for you, Walter. Walter's website linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Fascinating. We've got to stop this. They're making too much money on us. Fascinating. Next up on our floating format, as we talk about something on the paranormal side of life, don't go away.